Hello and welcome to the Sallie Tomato YouTube channel. I'm Kate, I'll be your instructor today. We are going to be making a super easy top using one piece of fabric. We're actually going to be using sequin fabric. I'll be taking you step by step through the Josephine blouse pattern, and before you know it, you're going to have a new addition to your wardrobe. This comfortable top, it has a stretchy neckline and waistline openings, and you can choose different sleeve lengths. It would be lovely in soft fabric that has a nice drape. I'll show you how to prepare the sequin fabric for basic hems, shape and finish the neckline, create the sleeves, and finish the waistline. The name was inspired by Josephine Baker, an American-born French entertainer who sparkled during her storied career and fascinating life. Be sure to purchase the pattern and your fabric before taking this class. The pattern and your supplies can be purchased from our website or request them at your local sewing shop. We encourage you to shop local whenever you can. So gather your fabric, let's get a few supplies, and I'll meet you in class at the work table. For the Josephine blouse, you'll need a main fabric and a coordinating elastic. This is a fold-over elastic that we're using, which makes for very easy finishing for our top. I love this pattern for the sequins because the simplicity and minimal sewing of the pattern. And when picking or selecting your sequin fabric, take a look at how the sequins are attached to the base fabric. This fabric has the sequins running in rows, so they're a little bit lighter. It's a little bit lighter weight fabric. You can see the stitching on the reverse side. It's just in rows, makes it very easy to sew. And then I'm also going to show you two other fabrics. Now this is again a sequin fabric. This is attached to a mesh, very sheer, which helps make it a lightweight fabric. And you can see that the stitching covers the entire back. So these sequins are layered, making a very full coverage in the fabric itself. And then this fabric here in the purple, this has a woven fabric, actually a charmeuse fabric. So again, very lightweight, but a little more substantial than the mesh. And you can actually hopefully see how those sequins are attached. It's almost a zigzag. And again, the rows are overlapping. So it gives a almost a mermaid effect. But again, this will make your fabric a little heavier. It won't drape maybe quite as beautifully as this fabric where it has some sheerness. This also has a mesh backing, which again makes it very lightweight. The next step is to gather just a few tools and notions to have at your work area, and you'll find those listed in your pattern. Here's a tip for a longer blouse length. The blouse that we'll be making following the instructions is for a 24-inch long or length in the blouse, and that would be from the shoulder to the waist. So if you prefer a longer length, simply purchase additional fabric, and then you'll cut two panels, a panel for the front and a panel for the back, and then sew those two panels together in the middle so that you'll have a shoulder seam, and that will make it very easy for you to have a longer blouse length. If you've chosen sequins fabrics, I'd also recommend visiting our blog to review Jess's tips on how to sew with sequins fabric. Follow your pattern for cutting the dimensions of the fabric and also the fold-over elastic. Reserve the remaining elastic for your blouse waistline. Next, we're going to prepare the sequins fabric. The sequins fabric may need a little prep work. I have just started here cutting a few or removing some of the sequins rows from the edge of my fabric. And this will be where we turn under a hem. So this is optional. I have sewed through these sequins. They are a plastic, so they aren't going to damage your sewing machine irreparably, but it is much more comfortable. And you can see I'm just cutting half of the sequin. I am trying very hard not to cut into the stitches because that, depending on how those sequins are attached, if you cut the thread itself, it could unravel the entire row of sequins. And further raveling can be detrimental. So this does take a little bit of time, but this is also a great opportunity to listen to your favorite music or put on that favorite podcast that you haven't had time to listen to. So here we go. I've just started prepping this hem edge. I'll do the opposite hem edge as well on the opposite end of the fabric. So as soon as I clean up all these sequins, I'll be right back. All right, I did clean up my sequins here, but I do need to also trim away some of the selvage edge of the mesh, but I am allowing a seam allowance on this edge closest to the sequins. So you can do that too, trim away the excess selvage edge of your fabric, but at the same time keeping a hem allowance or seam allowance that we'll be using as we create our Josephine blouse. Okay, now we can make progress. Here we have our hem. What we're simply going to do is just fold that hem under to the wrong side, so wrong sides together, and we'll pin or clip this in place. Now, if you do have a base fabric that ravels, you could overlock the edge and then fold under, or you could fold under a little bit and then fold under again, concealing or encasing that edge if it would fray. But with the mesh, we really don't have to worry about fraying at all. So I'm simply just going to turn the hem to the wrong side, and pins or wonder clips work just fine. I'll pin the entire sleeve edge hem on one side, and then we'll do the same on the opposite side and just fold under a hem, and then we'll head to the machine and stitch those hems in place. So that's the next step, is to press under or fold under really our hems and pin them in place. Now at the sewing machine with right side up, sew the hem, catching the allowance. You'll repeat the same step for the opposite edge. You may find adding narrow strips of pattern tissue paper under the layers of the mesh fabric helpful, aiding in evenly stitching the hems. The tissue paper easily tears away after sewing. All right, here's another tip for sewing with the mesh fabric. Try using a very narrow zigzag stitch that's about 0.5 to 1.0 width. This gives the stitching just the tiniest bit of stretch, being a very subtle zigzag, and it will be a little bit similar to the mesh base of the sequin fabric, and that can help with your stitching as well. And from the right side of the fabric, it's barely noticeable. So hopefully you can see that little bit of a zigzag, but really, really hard to see at first glance. So just a quick tip. All right, for the neckline, once you have your fabric folded, now in the instructions we mark a center front and we'll line our pattern up with center front, but as you are looking at my piece here, my sample, I have an extra fold at the center front and center back and folds at our shoulders. So now we are going to place our template, which you can either trace or cut out right from your pattern. And then with a marking pen or pencil, trace that curved edge. I've aligned the center front of the template with my folds, or you'll align them with your center marking following your pattern. And then I'm just going to trace along the curved edge of the template. The longest edge of the neckline template is along the shoulder folds. So make sure that you have that aligned correctly. And then after tracing, we'll simply cut out along that marked line. All right, I'm going to try to neatly cut this out, and there will be sequins flying, but I'm trying to be as accurate to the pattern as possible. I'm cheating a little bit. I think it is more accurate to mark your fabric, but this can work. Just cut carefully and slowly. And we're going to remove our neckline cutout. All right, here we have the neckline cutout, but I am not unfolding my top yet. Keep that there because we want to, before any folds move, use a pin to mark both top shoulder folds. This will come in handy when we are adding the neckline elastic. So we need to mark our shoulder folds right there. And then we also need to mark our center front and our center back. So in my case, I'm just pinning the fold very carefully. But if you've already marked your fabric at center front and center back, you should be just fine. But just make sure, and I'm just going to pinch this and follow my pin from the front mark and make sure that I didn't pin the two layers together. So there we are. We have front and back center pinned and matched, and then also our shoulder folds. I have a pin mark. So we can clean this up. I'm just going to fold my top gently and put it aside, and then we'll start our elastic for the neckline. All right, our next step is to take our piece C elastic and fold it in half, right sides together. So meeting the right sides, we are going to just pin the raw ends together or use a wonder clip. That works really handy there. And we are just going to go to your sewing machine and stitch a seam going across the ends, and I'll meet you right back at the work table. Okay, now that we have that seam stitched, simply press that seam allowance open with your fingers, and then we're going to fold our elastic in half at the seam. That will become our center back seam. And I'm going to pin mark, or you could use a removable pen or a piece of chalk. Pin mark the center front. So we have the seam as our center back, a pin as our center front. Then bring those two together, meeting the center back and seam, the center back seam with the center front pin. And then we're going to pin what will become our shoulder marks. And let's get the second one pinned here as well. Make sure the center front and center back stay aligned, and we'll mark each shoulder seam. All right, and I think we're ready for the next step. Adding our elastic to our neckline. So first I'm going to unpin my lower bottom hem layers. I don't think I need these clips anymore, so we can get those out of the way. And then we are going to carefully open up our top so that we can see our neckline curve. And let's get our elastic with the markings, the marked pins. All right, and I'm going to designate this as the back, so we are just going to fold the elastic over our neckline edge, and I'm going to align my seam of the elastic center back where my pin was, and then I'm going to just pin directly through all the layers to hold that in place. And we'll move on to our shoulder seam, the next set of pins. And here I should have pinned with the head of the pin the opposite spot, so we'll just flip that, making sure that the neckline fabric is to the fold or center of the elastic, and remove that pin kind of carefully. Pull that pin out a little bit, and if you need to, just pin with a second pin right at the spot where both pins are aligned, and then fold over your elastic. And you could use, and then add a pin, you could use wonder clips, but I found that the wonder clips slip a little bit on the elastic. So I felt that my elastic was more securely held in place by using a regular pin. So here we go. Here we have center front of the elastic, center front of our top, and get that along the center of the elastic. I have my raw edge of my fabric along the center of the elastic. I'll remove that pin just briefly, fold the elastic over the fabric edge, and then pin. And we'll move on to our other side. This time I'm just going to replace the existing pin with the other pin so I can fold the elastic very easily over it. And here we go. I'll just fold the elastic over at our, what will be our shoulder seam, and pin. And then we can do the same, stretching the elastic, because the elastic is a little smaller than the neckline opening, which is what we want. And I am just making sure that as I stretch the elastic, my fabric is centered and allowing the elastic to relax, and add a pin. So you'll do that around the entire neckline, and then we'll head to our sewing machine. All right, with right sides up, top stitch in from the folded edge, and it's all right if you stretch the elastic to match the stretch of the fabric. This is where the mesh base is really nice to be sewing with. Also, you might want to refer to your sewing machine manual and try a very narrow zigzag stitch again at the 0.5 or 1.0 width. This gives the stitching a slight stretch and is really compatible with this fabric and the elastic. And you're going to stitch all the way around the neckline. And this is where it's helpful. Using this stiletto, I can just gently tuck the sequin fabric in between the layers of the elastic before I continue stitching. Now we need to have our hip measurement to figure out our waistline elastic for our Josephine blouse. So take your tape measure and measure the fullest part of your hip. And I won't say what mine is right now, but we're going to just write that measurement down. And then I'm just quickly folding my tape measure in half to find the half hip measurement. That's also important. So write that down also on your pattern, and I'll reassemble here and I'll see you at the work table. Okay, now back at the work table, I have already turned my fabric for my top right sides together. You can see I have the neckline finished here, and just getting a head start, I have also marked the lower edge or bottom edge of my top with center front and center back pins. And those are going to be needed for our waistline, which is going to be coming from our hip measurement. So once you have your center front and center back marked, you're going to take that half hip measurement, that was the shorter one, and you're going to mark on either side of your center front that distance. So for example, if your hip measurement is say 40 inches, your half measurement or half hip measurement would be 20 inches. So that means you'll measure 10 inches in one direction and 10 inches in the other direction. So this whole length would be 20 inches. So just so you can see that much better, I'm going to just use Wonder Clip at each end of my half hip measurement. So this should be the half hip measurement, and we'll be ready to stitch from, and I'm going to show you right here on the work table. We are going to stitch from the hem edge of our sleeve all the way up to our marker or Wonder Clip, wherever your half hip measurement ends for the waistline opening. So we'll stitch this sleeve, and we'll do the same for the opposite sleeve. Again, making sure right sides are together and aligned, and then stitch from the hem allowance of the sleeve in towards your mark. So this section will remain completely open. All right, I'll get this pinned and I'll see you at the sewing machine. All right, here at the sewing machine, I'm going to begin sewing at the sleeve hem, and remember to back stitch at the beginning and end. And this is where it comes in handy to have this seam allowance created by our selvage edge. That way we can really avoid stitching most of the sequin edge, which makes very clean stitching. And again, if you're using mesh, you may want to have a little tissue paper underneath the seam edge, and that will help keep your stitching nice and even and flowing underneath this presser foot very easily. So let's get started. And remember to back stitch at the end of your seam. This will be the edge closest to your waistline opening, so you do want that reinforced there. And you'll repeat that same process for the opposite sleeve. All right, we have our seams for the sleeve sewn. You can see how nicely that turned out by using the seam allowance as which was our selvage. So we have our seams. I have still my center front and center back pins for markings. And then we are going to take our elastic and, following your pattern, cut your elastic. This will be based on your full hip measurement, so follow the pattern for that. We're going to, again, just like our neckline elastic, right sides together and sew a seam with the seam allowance, again following your pattern for that exact measurement, and we'll press that open, and then we'll attach our elastic to our waistline of our Josephine blouse. All right, and just a quick reminder, as you're following the instructions for adding your waistline elastic, make sure you mark the center front, center back of your elastic, as well as dividing it in half to mark a side seam, which would be your kind of your sleeve seam, and another side or sleeve seam, and then match the center front of the elastic to the center front of your top. And I'll just fold this over and pin. And one tip that I did find with the mesh base sequin fabric is, for this waistline elastic, I allowed the allowance, just that mesh selvage edge, to fold over, and then I aligned my sequin edge with the center of the elastic. It made it I just felt it was a little stronger and a little more secure. But if you're using a fabric that does not have that little mesh selvage edge that we allowed ahead of time, if it were a regular fabric, don't worry about it. You'll be just fine. It's just, there is quite a bit of weight on that little mesh edge. So I found if I just folded it over inside the elastic, I felt it was much more secure. And then you'll align and pin your side marked elastic with the seam of your sleeve again. And this is where that mesh is so nice and soft that you can kind of just push it into place at that side seam. It may look a little cumbersome, but once you get it pinned and sewn, it'll lay nice and smooth. So again, pin all the way around, again, stretching your elastic to stretch with the fabric. All right, so get that pinned, and then you'll sew just as you did for the neckline, and I'll see you in a bit. Okay, and here I thought I'd show you just a quick stop at the sewing machine as to how I'm working with that side seam, or this would be the sleeve seam. It's really at the bottom of the sleeve, and how I'm tucking that into the elastic. Here you can see my marking for the elastic at that sleeve seam, and I'm just going to stretch and then fold it over. I'm pinching it, and then we're going to stitch. Remove the pin, and again, I'm allowing the mesh to fold under just a little bit and tucking that in. And if you need to, lift up the presser foot and maneuver the fabric a little bit. You want to make sure that the fabric is getting caught right at that side seam. So double check that it's getting caught in between the layers of elastic before you continue. And lower that presser foot and we'll finish up this seam. right, our Josephine blouse is progressing. After you turn it inside, or right side out, I should say, there is one last step, but that is completely optional, and I'll try to show it here. I don't have just a lot of space, but at your waistline opening, the elastic waistline opening, if you smooth your top layers so that the sleeve edges are in line and everything's smooth, so when you're using a larger table or have a larger space than I've got, this will be much easier for you. Have all the top smoothed out so it's even and laying flat. And then from your corner or edge of your elastic at the seam of your sleeve, you'll mark a line vertically up to the point mentioned in your pattern, and then you'll sew through all the layers. Essentially, you're creating a side seam just by a vertical line from the bottom hem or elastic edge up part way of your top, and that will create a side seam. Again, completely optional, but I do find it's a little more comfortable. The top doesn't shift quite as much when I have that side seam. So you'll do the same thing for the opposite side. Find your seam right there and at the elastic, and then go up vertically. All right? So I'll see you in a minute. Congratulations on your beautiful top. Time for a modeling session and have a little fun, and I'm sure you're going to sparkle in your Josephine top. Thank you so much for joining me and sewing with me. I hope you've learned a few extra tips and techniques working with sequin fabric, and most of all, I hope you had fun. If you enjoyed this mini pattern, join us for our monthly mini club for only $5 a month and receive a new mini pattern in your mailbox or inbox each month. These mini patterns are designed for all skill levels and are intended to be a quick sew project. Most patterns will include a video tutorial on our YouTube channel. And we'd love to see you sparkle in your Josephine top. So be sure to tag us at #SallieTomato and #Josephine blouse pattern. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and comment. We love hearing from you, and be sure to subscribe. So we do read all those comments that you send us. So again, thank you and have a great making day.